Welcome to today's webinar. I want to thank you so much for joining us. My name is Rhonda Seelinger, and I'm the Customer Engagement Manager for iClicker. And we are really thankful that you chose to spend some time with us today. We are going to get started here in a couple minutes. Before we do, I just want to make a couple quick announcements. First, we are recording the webinar, and we will send a follow-up link to everyone who's registered. So please know that that's coming, and you're welcome to share that with colleagues that you think may be interested. And also, you might have just heard that little announcement. Everyone is automatically muted, and this just helps us keep out background noise. We do want to hear from you very much, so please use either the chat feature or the question and answer feature, and we'll do our best to address any questions or comments that we have. There are some natural kind of stopping points through the presentation, so definitely take advantage of those opportunities. And with that, I am very pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Matt Evans of the University of Wisconsin at Eau Claire. And Matt is here to talk about how he gets students to class and keeps them engaged once they're there. Matt?
Thank you, Rhonda. Just as a matter of background, I teach physics, and I've been teaching for over 18 years. And I've actually been using technology in my classrooms, like the clicker and a few other versions before that, for over 10 years. And so one of the things I always ask myself is, why am I using this, and what are the results I want to get from it? And so what I want to start with today is really looking at the new features that are coming up with iClicker, namely starting with the attendance feature. So this is actually just one of the screens that comes up when you're looking at the attendance for a class. This is one of the classes that I've taught before, and what you're looking at is just what an instructor can see. And one of the things that we want to think about when using any technology is how do you want to use this? So for me, I want to get my students to class. I want them to get to participate. And so if you award participation points, or you have some sort of attendance policy that says that after a certain number of absences that their grade gets lowered, well, this actually is one of the new parts of the system that can really help you. One of the things that I always dread is that email from our registrar after 2 weeks saying who hasn't attended. And when you have a class of, say, 100 to 150 students, sometimes you haven't quite gotten that reporting in yet, but with a system such as this, you can easily see who's actually attended at least one class. All right, so in order to just kind of see what we can do, running an attendance session is actually quite easy in this program. If you want to, you can just go to the web version of this program and just start taking attendance. So this is one way to do it. It's not actually the way I do it, and as you can see, I took a screenshot where I let it run for 5 minutes and no one has checked in because I just needed this screenshot. One of the nice things about running an attendance session in a large classroom is you can actually see who's checking in and who isn't by clicking on those little arrows. And what this does is it allows you to record who's there and who's not. Now there's some really nice features that I like to use so that I don't have to do this manually myself every time. And so there's some settings in the set and required link that are shown. And the first one is one that a lot of people had requested, and that is to set a location. One of the things is, you want to make sure that, they're not tubing down the river at the same time as they're answering questions for your class. And so with the attendance feature in iClicker, you can actually select where your classroom is and then select the radius as to how far out you want that student to be located in order for them to be counted as present. One of the things that we noticed is that this works very well. The software works very well. It's usually, if there's any problems, it's always the student not wanting to turn on their location feature on their phone. And of course, that defeats the purpose of setting that location and making sure that they're in that classroom. The other things that I have found very useful when using this attendance feature is auto-running my attendance. And this is one thing where I set this at the beginning of my semester, and I never think about running an attendance session. It just runs automatically on my class days. So if you look at that auto-run, the very top part of this, it says auto run attendance from, and then it gives me a central time zone because that's where I'm located, and then I can actually put in the time where I want that attendance to run. Now for me, what you will see is that I start it before class starts. And this is important because I want to have the attendance feature run before I start my session where I collect answers. That allows those people who are using their devices to be marked as present. The second thing you note is that I do run it for almost my entire class, and the reason I do that actually comes into play when you look down at the very last one where it says iClicker remotes. It says allow iClicker remote usage for attendance. What that means is that if a student has a physical remote, if they answer any question during the time that auto attendance is running, they will be marked as present. Now the point to this is that somebody who's using a physical device, they have to be within range of the base in order to get that answer to be submitted, and so you would assume that they are in the classroom. So what I just want to point out that there are two ways to answer questions and to be marked as present. You can either use the online app, the iClicker REEF app that a student will have on their device, either a phone or a computer, and they can actually check into the session to be marked as present, and somebody who has a physical device in that room will just answer any question and they will be marked as present. And so what this does is it allows you to have different types of devices in your classroom depending on whether your school's policy is to have to allow phones in the classroom or not. And I've found that it's quite effective because I can capture all of that attendance data very quickly. So going back to that attendance frame on the web version of iClicker, you can actually pull up all of these data points, and as you can see in session 17, I have sorted this by unexcused absences, and I can see how many unexcused absences each person has. The check marks indicate that they've been there, and absence means that they did not check in or they didn't answer any of the questions. Now, a couple of things that are important in the fact that some people use the attendance feature to award points, or they use it to award grades. So one of the things that is built into this attendance feature is the ability to go back and click on one of those absences and actually make it excused. So in the lower left here, you can see I've blown up a little piece of the table, and you can see in the upper right is excused, and even in the upper right of that there's a little triangle, and this just means that you have gone in and you have changed something, so you can easily see what you've gone in and changed throughout your tables, and you can even type in some note to say why they were excused. What this does is it allows you to go back to those absences. If I just click back, you can actually change, say, that last absence to excused, and then their excused absences will go down to 4, and so you can easily keep track of those total numbers. Now, the other thing that I find very important about this attendance feature is I can easily look at attendance maybe once a week to see are there any problems that start showing up. And in this case, I see that top student has been absent the last couple of days. They were there the first part of the week, they weren't there the last part of the week, and since they're already at that 5 unexcused absences, that might be a place where I just send off a quick note saying, hey, I've noticed you've been missing from class. Is there something that I should know about. All of us have those techniques, but it is one of those things when they realize that you're trying to help them learn, and you have this device to see when they're not showing up. It can actually be very powerful. Not so much that they're being watched, but maybe that somebody actually cares. So especially as our classrooms might get bigger and bigger, this is a handy tool to be able to quickly go through and see what's going on. Now, one of the things that always is brought up is cheating and academic integrity. And so what I always tell people is confront that cheating directly. Put it in your syllabus and talk about it. Now, for me, I only award maybe 5 to 10% of my total points through using participatory practices in my class. And I want them to understand that one day is not enough to hurt that grade. And so if they do something, if they have somebody else's clicker or they're accessing the poll from outside the classroom, that I consider that misconduct and that it will be brought up. Now, everyone has their own way of doing this, but being very clear up front about what you're trying to do with the technology in class is really beneficial to the student, and it really helps not have those questions come up later in the semester. Now, the other half of this that's newish is the fact that they have an online gradebook. And what this means is that all of your data is actually being stored up in the cloud. And I've done some testing, and it seems like the ability for people to answer questions on their devices is as fast, if not faster, than somebody using the physical clicker in the classroom. And the nice thing about having everything stored up online is that you can actually access this from any computer, and you can see what's going on and do a few grading things. So, for instance, I can look at my class. I can see how everyone's doing in this case. In the upper right, in the red box, there's something called Sync Scores to LMS and Export. Now, most people know that you can export the data, and with that export, you'll get each of your sessions, and it'll show all those points. The second button there says Sync Scores to LMS. So if you use an LMS, and in my case I use D2L, if I click on that button, the total percentage from this class will actually be uploaded directly to my D2L gradebook, and that student will have access to that grade. What that does is it allows me to instantaneously show them how they're doing in the class. Sometime very soon, we'll actually have I think by spring semester, you'll be able to export each session individually, and then allow your LMS to do things like drop the lowest 3 or 4 scores, treat some of the sessions as quizzes and some of them as just polls, and so on. But this really helps me understand or convey to the student what's going on very quickly, whether their grade is being affected by their participation and performance in the classroom. The other thing that's highlighted here is that LMS connection, and in order to do this syncing to LMS, the student would just register for the class through your LMS system. You set it up with a link, and all the students follow that link in order to match these two things up. I've been using this for probably over 2 years now, and it's getting easier and better for the students, and it makes it so I don't have to deal with rosters when people they get dropped out of the LMS, and so I don't have to worry about it because the LMS is keeping track of this roster. Now, other things that I can look at is that total performance. So you can easily see who isn't responding in class, and as you can see, there are the very top person there, me. I'm a member of my own class, and I have never answered any of my own quizzes. So this is one of those things where, once again, you can see immediately how people are doing and be able to see, is it that their participation is poor or their performance is poor as you go through. And The other thing that you should note is if you wanted to go in and award points, you could actually just click on that no response, and you can actually change that score for that person for that day. Sometimes people will show up and you'll say, look, fine, I'll give you the participation points for the day, but not the points for getting it right. Now, a couple of things about that I will talk about scoring in a little bit, but I just want to pause just briefly at this point to see, is there anything that people have questions on about the attendance or the online gradebook? Rhonda, has anything come on? Or
I don't see anything yet. Remember, just use either the chat or the question and answer box, and I will be able to monitor those and ask.
All right, sounds great. Now I'm going to move on and actually just talk about one of the reasons why you would want to use a system in your classroom that allows you to both monitor how students are doing. I think it's very important to sort of award them with participation and performance points within the class, and in order to have them engage with the material, I need to have a way for me to get responses from everyone. So as educators, we want to engage and challenge and promote thinking amongst all of our students, and oftentimes we do this. You ask a question and then you start to listen to a few students. They answer the questions, but oftentimes if we just get those students responding to us, not all of the students are able to engage in that material quite as well. They may wait for that smart kid, or they might just sort of zone out because they're not being asked that question and somebody else will take care of it. So one of the things I think about is, say this is my typical class, and I ask to my class, well, what do you like to eat? And Zaina the zebra says, oh, I like to eat twigs and bark. And then Casey the cow says, oh, I like to eat grass. And Pablo the panda says, oh, I like to eat bamboo. And so when you start looking out over your class, you might make an assumption based on what you hear, which is that you have a class of herbivores. So you've actually made this assumption based on just the responses that you've heard. And that limits the class, because if you look out, maybe you see Alan the alligator quietly eating that steak sandwich, and so you go back and say, oh, well, it must be that just the black and white animals are herbivores. But even there, you might have that very quiet dog in the back that hasn't said anything, but is engaging in the material, but is not confident enough to speak up. And so what I like about this system, or any of these systems that you do in the classroom, is that it engages all of the students. And you're able to understand what's happening without without having to listen to every single student. You can actually assess, because when you look at my class, if these are the only people that are answering, I've really lost out on a lot of the richness of my class. And in my case, in sciences, you might just have the, quote, smart kids answering, and it leaves a few people maybe disengaged and not as committed to that class. So what I'm thinking is that with these types of systems, you can actually get everyone to engage in the material regardless of whether they want to speak. So how do I do that? Well, the very first thing I do every single class is I have a question ready for them when they show up. So not only is that attendance feature running, I also have a question for them to answer. So in this case, I'm asking about a car hitting a wall, and we talk about that as priming the pump. I did not make up that phrase. It's just one of those things where you want them to be ready to go by the time the bell rings, or by the time that you start class. And oftentimes I will have 2 or 3 questions, and they vary as to what I'm trying to do, but oftentimes they could be 3 pre-reading questions where you ask them to read something before and you're just trying to test to see where they are. It could be that you review the previous class material. And what I find is that once they get there, right at that time it starts, I will just announce 1 minute, because they know they have 1 minute remaining to answer that question. And if you do this every day, by the second week, they know that they need to be in their seats and ready to go at that bell, and that you're going to just move through these series of questions very quickly. So not only are you getting them in their seats, you're taking that attendance, and you're preparing them to be ready to learn once you move on. So in this case, I asked this question, and then they all have answered individually, and the student will have some sort of emotional attachment to that material, and then they get to see whether they're right or not. And so just that, there are studies that show that just by answering the question, they're more engaged in the material. And for me, as I'm showing here, I always like to show that answer in some way where they definitely can see what's correct, and perhaps I will do a quick explanation of why, especially if not that many people had it correct. Other things to think about is just that learning pattern. So when we ask, have you ever been told what to think? I think back to your teenage years, right? You're told how to do something, and of course you rebel against that and you push back. And when we talk about this active participatory learning, we want to have that learning by doing, and we want the students to model that behavior and have those conversations amongst themselves in order to play with that language. I always get pushback from really good students who say, well, why should I be teaching somebody else? And one of the things I talk about is I want you to be explaining to somebody else, because both of you get better. The person who already knows it is actually moving up in their understanding by being able to explain it, and the person who didn't quite understand it has that chance to engage in the material by interacting and asking questions of somebody near them. And even in small classes, if you look at the left-hand picture here, you think, oh, it's a small class, everyone's going to be engaged. But if you look all the way to the left, there's somebody over in the corner reading a paper, while this professor thinks that they're engaging everyone equally. So even in the best of circumstances, sometimes it doesn't really work. There are plenty of studies that show that the peer discussion does work, and it's peer instruction with the ability of students to engage correctly. So this is just a study that showed that 52% of the people got the first question right. Right after that, they had the students talk to each other, and from there it went from 52% to about 67%, and then they asked a totally new question that 73% of the students got correct. So without doing any, without providing additional material to the students, we were able to increase that percentage just by having them talk to each other. Now, other things that I look at for using a polling system is you can actually do a lot of things. So it improves that engagement in the class. You can have that behavior change. If they actually have quizzing on pre-reading, they might do it more. Those who get it right, it boosts their confidence. Those who get it wrong, sometimes it's one of these things where if a lot of people are getting it wrong, I might show that and they don't feel quite as bad because it's a complicated question. And when some people, I'm imagining my class one day, I had only 40 people in the class. I knew them all, and 39 people had it right, and one person had it wrong. And I showed the results of the poll, and that person owned up to it, said, I had that wrong. And at that point, he actually explained what he was thinking, and he said, and I see why I'm wrong. And at that point, everyone else around him felt, maybe smug that they had it right, but they also saw that there was learning going on. And so I really, I think to those types of things where it allows students to engage with that material. Other things it does is it breaks up the class. We know that I've already been talking for too long. What is it, 7 minutes? You want to break up your class. You want to engage them. There's also times where I do a lot of board work for my class, and so I will have to erase the board. And I still use chalk even. And while I'm doing that, it takes 30 seconds. So I start a question when I know I'm going to erase the board, and it gets them doing something and engaging the material that I just finished. Do they understand the conceptual questions that were posed, and how does that dovetail with the numerical problem that I had just solved? Now, so what I'm looking at there is there's plenty of misconceptions in physics that I have, and so I can trip them up fairly easily. And it's not that I'm trying to get them to do things wrong. I'm trying to show them how their thinking can change, and they'll be better able to maybe see answers. And sometimes this response system is really just for me to see if I've done an okay job asking questions. So this would be a typical question. What you can see is that I've highlighted some of the words in my question, and I start the timer. The timer is in the lower right-hand corner here, and it shows me how many people have answered that. The other thing that's available, and this is one of the things that really helps my lectures, is that there is an iClicker base unit that we have in all of our classrooms on our campus. And so I always have the ability to see the numbers come up of how many people have answered each of these questions. And on the right-hand side, or the left-hand side, this sort of histogram, if you're using a dual display where you're projecting one and you can see the other that the students can't, you can actually open that up and see how are the students responding before showing that to your students or before moving on. So this would be a really good question where you have 55% have it correct, and that means 45% have it incorrect. And what you do at this point is you think, what do I want to do next? And this is, do you give them additional information? Do you take away all but two of the answers? Do you talk a little bit more about some material that might help them get to the right answer? And oftentimes, all I will have to do is say, you're not doing well. And they're conditioned when they hear that they're not doing well, that they need to maybe dig deeper into their understanding of the problem, and they do the work themselves. And sometimes they can get there, sometimes it will actually go to the wrong answer. But I can actually help the students along that educational journey without giving them the answer. And that's where, if you're told how to think, you don't absorb nearly as much as if you actually did the thinking yourself. So once again, I clearly show the answer, and it really does close that loop in the understanding of what I'm doing. Now, a couple of thoughts on the devices. I use a mixed classroom, and it's some students actually like using the physical iClicker remotes because it doesn't waste their battery. They don't have to have their phone. They're not using something. Plus, they've always been told keep your phones out of sight. Now, I'm okay with using the phones in the classroom, but once again, I have language in my syllabus that talks about correct usage of their phones in my classroom. The one drawback to having a mixed classroom of the physical clickers and the online is that you don't get to use as many of the cool answering features. Online, you can do heat maps. You can more easily do some other types of things, but I'm mostly an ABCDE type of person, and I use that quite effectively, and so I don't miss that, and I will like the day when I get all of the new clickers and the online clickers, but until then, I think I can do a really good job just using the multiple choice functions on the device. There is a function that will allow you to do quizzing where they can actually step through in their own time in order to answer questions, and so some people have been using that. I use that for things like at the end of a lab, they actually go through and answer some questions, and I can easily get those responses without having to grade those things later. Now, as far as advice goes, my main thing would be to make sure that you have clicker policies. Explain things to your students like your grading policy and why you're using it. Talk about that student interaction. Talk about, when an interesting question comes out where you have a bimodal distribution, you oftentimes can use that as a learning opportunity that helps the students see the nuances of your material. So the other thing that I always look at is you can see so much about your students learning in real time by having a system that gives you this feedback. And that's really helped my teaching because I don't take it personally when they don't get it. Sometimes it just means that I have to add that second or third or fourth different way of looking at it. Coming from the physics background, they oftentimes will, sort of push back against the material. But what I want them to do is really engage in it and see it for what it is, which is, they're surrounded by physics, and they should sort of embrace it in some way. And this really helps me get to that. Now, the other thing to think about is what questions do you pose? And one of the things that's sort of interesting about this is all of the questions that you ask, every time that you start a poll, it will take a screenshot of whatever's up on your screen. The other thing that you can do, which I have found very helpful, is every so often I will get something where I want to ask a completely new question, and I just write it on the board and start a poll. Now, you don't save the question in that case, but you do get that instant response of, are they getting this type of question? Obviously, for a new teacher that is kind of set to their script, this is not quite as easy, but it does open up the possibility of, what's your favorite movie this week, and you put that up on the board. Maybe it's relevant to your class. And so it's a quick little check-in sort of thing that helps people maybe answer something that would be interesting to discuss. Other things that I think are important, you can build confidence with that practice. There's all sorts of studies that basically say immediate recall, you can retain almost 100%, and it drops to, say, 70% after 20 minutes. If you can engage them through this recall and asking the question again and through peer teaching, that percentage does go up. And so we know this from a lot of the different studies. Now, just to kind of lead you through something that I developed because I've used the system so long, I actually have a system where I throw a ball up in the air and I ask them, what's the acceleration at the top? And this is where it's a question that typically I will get from maybe 10 to 30% correct the first time I ask this, even if I have just gone over this. And one of the main things here is, what do I do next? And that's one of the strengths of, if you know that they're not getting something, what you do next is really helpful. Do you just cajole them into talking to each other? Do you ask another question? Do you put it on the board? Do you show the results? And in this case, because this has happened again and again, I've developed a series of questions that hopefully will lead them there. And this next one, the answer would be 0, but I have 2 zeros on there. I'm actually doing whether the correct units. And then I ask, instead of acceleration, I ask what the velocity is at the top, because a lot of them are confusing velocity with acceleration. So with that bolding of the question, they get to start seeing where they might be getting this wrong. And then maybe I go back and I ask the exact same question again, and I get rid of the ones that almost nobody is answering and try to get them to answer. So in this case, the acceleration is always negative 9.8 meters per second squared. it stops, so its velocity is 0 at the top. And it's just an exercise that teases out something that over the years I've seen has really been confounding. And the students, once they engage and have made that emotional commitment to the material, they actually have a little bit more skin in the game, as they say, and so they'll actually maybe try a little bit harder to understand where they're doing things incorrectly. Now, a couple of things, make it challenging. I always like to have questions that are somewhere between 60 to 70% correct. If it's too hard, obviously you have to do something different, that just-in-time teaching. If it's too easy, it's just like, yeah, they're done, and then they start talking about something else completely right off the bat. Also, when you let them talk to each other, you can actually hear what's going on, and that will help you see where their misunderstanding is, which you can then maybe bring back to the entire class, or immediately confront some of those misconceptions. And it can be brought back to the class to just do a little bit of group discussion. Other things that I do, it's one of those things where testing is always a big thing. I use some multiple choice in my testing, and so I tell them, all right, I like using multiple choice in my lectures because it lets me test out some of that wording. And if I see a question hasn't been written correctly, then I won't use it on the test. And so that engages them to, maybe pick out misconceptions themselves. The other thing that I always kind of go back to is when we look at Bloom's taxonomy, we want to bring them up and move them beyond just memorizing something. Asking what the capital of Minnesota is isn't really that interesting, but maybe asking, why did the capital of Minnesota move from X to Y? That would actually be something that's more apply and analyze. So it's really moving up that scale. So at this point, I thank you for listening. Hopefully you've seen some things that you can try out in your own classroom and maybe see the usage of iClicker in your classroom.
Matt, we do have a question that I think is really interesting. Does the system allow you to take attendance at the beginning and at the end of class so as to give attendance points to only those students who attend the entire class?
You could do that, and the way that I might think about doing that would be to just take 2 attendance sessions, and then then you might have to look to see who's the person who wasn't there at one of those 2, but that would have to be 2 discrete attendance sessions. So you could have one auto run at the end of your class, in the last, say, 5 minutes, and make sure you ask that question in the last 5 minutes. And you could do one that you manually run at the beginning and just compare those 2.
Great, thanks. Let's see. I'm scrolling through a couple questions. One asked a question if we integrate or sync to Moodle, and we do.
Yes, it's always the, well, we use, this, and so to say LMS all the time is always, I'm trying not to say D2L. And that's the nice thing is that that setup, it's fairly easy to do, and once you start doing that, you'll see the ease with which the students can see their grades, and I think that has been really a good integration for this system.
Yeah. There's a question, how do you engage high school senior students in college credit classes from a high school academy? I'm not sure, Matt, if that's something you have experience with or any suggestions for.
Well, I think that this is, if you are using, we actually have a nursing program here at my university, and they have 2 classrooms because we have one in our city and then we have one 60 miles away, and all of their classes are taught that way. And so with this system, they actually, when they ask the question, that question goes out to that remote site. So if you have students in a different site, they can actually be answering those questions Obviously, you would not want to use the location attendance feature if you have a class set up like that. But they do get to interact with that classroom in a way where they're part of that of those answers coming in. And so it would be a matter of making sure that you're setting up that that classroom to also have those discussions amongst themselves and make sure that they understand the what you're trying to do with that polling.
Thanks. There's another question. Would a student have to purchase the device? And I think by that they mean clicker, or is there an app to put on their own device?
Right, so they could actually do either. And at my school, we've been around for a while, and so everyone had the physical clickers. And now we're kind of moving towards online and apps. So we probably still have about 60% of our students who have the physical clicker that they've purchased, and the other 40% are buying a subscription license to answer using the online app. And more of that information can be found, at the iClicker site, and all the pricing and things like that are up there.
Yep. And one final question that I see is, when can we access the recording of this webinar? And Matt, I can take this one. As I mentioned earlier, we are recording the broadcast, and it usually takes us maybe a day or so to get that out to everybody. So just as quickly as we can send it out, we will. Shouldn't be too much longer, though. All right. Anything else before we wrap it up?
Well, my email's up there. If you think of questions in the next ever, just shoot me an email, and I can answer those best I can.
Great. Thank you. All right. Well, I don't see anything new coming through, so we definitely, again, just want to thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.